Colorado is entering a spring with almost no snow left on its mountains. That is highly unusual because April 1st is normally the point when the state reaches its peak snowpack, the most important part of its water reserve for the dry season ahead. But in 2026, federal surveys at 64 long-term monitoring sites found that 60 of them recorded their lowest levels ever, and 18 had no snow left to measure at all. When the upstream reserve disappears in a way like this, what is under threat is not just Colorado's winter landscape. What is under threat is an entire lifeline flowing downstream. The Colorado River does not just supply water to a few small cities. It supports 40 million people, more than 5 million acres of farmland, and 30 tribal nations across the American West. That is why, when the snowpack in the Rocky Mountains fails to build, the pressure immediately shifts to the region's largest reservoirs. Lake Mead has already dropped 3.5 feet in just 1 month. Lake Powell is being pulled down toward the 3,490-foot elevation, the minimum level at which Glen Canyon Dam can still generate electricity. If the water level continues to fall, this dam could lose its ability to produce power for the first time. That is a serious warning sign, because it shows that this crisis is no longer only about water shortages. It is already beginning to affect power generation, agriculture, and the stability of an entire region. The first impacts are already becoming very clear. Denver has had to impose water restrictions since March 25th. Many ski resorts in the Rockies have closed earlier than usual. The Ute Mountain Ute tribe has had to reduce planting because there is no longer enough water to maintain food production. For communities like these, this is not a dry climate report. This is pressure moving directly into daily life, into planting seasons, into livelihoods, and into the growing sense of anxiety about the hotter months ahead. What makes this situation more worrying is that it does not look like a normal dry season that will simply rebalance after a few rounds of rain. What is happening now shows that the safety buffer across the entire basin is shrinking very quickly. And once that buffer is gone, the question is no longer how little snow Colorado has. The question is why such a large structure was pushed to such a fragile point without being corrected earlier. But if we only look at the snow disappearing from the mountains, we still do not see the most troubling part of this story. The dry and warm winter only made the crisis reveal itself faster. The deeper problem is that the Colorado River no longer carries as much water as the numbers once promised on paper. Yet the way that water is divided is still tied to an old arrangement that has changed too slowly and moved further and further away from reality. The agreement that divided the waters of the Colorado River was signed in 1922, at a time when people believed the river could provide about 15 million acre-feet of water each year for the upper basin and the lower basin. But over the past 26 years, the actual average flow has been only about 12.5 million acre-feet a year. That gap is no longer just a technical detail. It is the shortage that has been quietly building for years, and it is now placing its full weight on reservoirs, farmland, cities, and the communities that depend on this river. What makes the situation even more tense is that the 7 states sharing the Colorado River still have not been able to agree on how to deal with that shortage. They missed the federal deadline on February 14th to reach a new agreement for the period after 2026. The lower basin wants clear commitments on cuts. The upper basin argues that it is being asked to carry a problem it did not create, with water it does not actually have. While both sides continue to argue, the water levels in the reservoirs keep falling. Extreme weather is pushing more pressure onto an arrangement that is already outdated and slow to change, causing the risks to pile up all at once. The U.S. Department of the Interior has said it will continue the rulemaking process on a unilateral track if the states cannot reach an agreement before October 1st. If that happens, it could mark the first time in the history of the Colorado River that mandatory water cuts are imposed at the federal level. And when a lifeline river is pulled into a deadlock like this, the impact will not stop at the negotiating table. It will fall directly onto electricity, agriculture, and the daily lives of tens of millions of people downstream. The sharp drop in snowpack at the headwaters is not just a bad sign in the mountains. It also means the amount of water flowing downstream is starting to fall noticeably, and the largest reservoirs in the American West are the first places to feel that pressure. The Bureau of Reclamation's spring forecast shows that from April through July, the inflow into Lake Powell could be only about 38% of normal. That is a serious number, because it shows that the most important water supply for keeping the entire basin stable is shrinking at the very time of year when it should be receiving its strongest replenishment. From that point on, the risks begin to connect very quickly. Lake Powell is currently sitting at about 3,531 feet above sea level and is projected to fall to 3,490 feet by December. That is the minimum level at which Glen Canyon Dam can still generate power. If the lake drops any lower, the turbines will no longer have enough water to operate. Downstream, Lake Mead is also continuing to fall. In March alone, its surface dropped another 3.5 feet. Hoover Dam, which once could generate 2,080 megawatts when the reservoir was full, is now operating at about 1,340 megawatts, or roughly 63% of its former capacity. If Lake Mead falls below 1,035 feet, 12 of its 17 turbines will have to shut down. What makes this more alarming is that the crisis does not stop at falling water levels. Once the reservoirs drop too far, the effects spread very quickly. Power output declines. Irrigation water becomes more limited. Cities are forced to tighten water use. Agriculture also has to accept cuts just as the hotter months are approaching. At the same time, wildfire risk increases because the mountains dry out faster, while the spring runoff is too weak to make up for the shortage that has already been building. The danger is that these pressures do not happen separately. They build on one another, overlap, and eventually fall onto people's daily lives, from electricity and water to their livelihoods. And as the water levels in the largest reservoirs move closer to dangerous thresholds, the bigger question is no longer just how much water is left. The bigger question is which areas will be hit first, and what kind of price the people there will have to pay. As water levels continue to fall, and the states still cannot find common ground, the pressure is becoming most visible in the daily lives of the communities that depend directly on this river. One of the clearest examples is the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, which has had to reduce planting on its land because there is no longer enough water to grow food. This is not a theoretical warning. It is a sign that the crisis has already reached people's livelihoods, their meals, and their ability to cope in places that were already more vulnerable to begin with. In larger cities, the response has also begun, but in a way that shows there is not much room left. Denver declared Stage 1 drought restrictions on March 25th. Under those rules, even-numbered addresses may water lawns only on Sundays and Thursdays, while odd-numbered addresses may do so only on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Restaurants have also been advised to serve water only when customers ask for it. These changes may sound small, but they reflect something very clear. Water is no longer abundant enough for people to keep using it the way they used to. Once those rules begin to reach lawns and dinner tables, the crisis is no longer just something on a map. It has entered daily life. What is even more concerning is that people's response still does not always match the level of danger. The original report quotes a representative from Aurora Water, saying that their office had already seen many homeowners associations turning on sprinkler systems as early as February, 2 full months before the growing season, while the worst snowpack in recorded history was unfolding in the mountains above. That detail points to a very clear reality. Nature can push risk upward very quickly, but human habits often change much more slowly. And that is exactly how the damage begins to grow. For communities like the Ute Mountain Ute, and for families living off the water of the Colorado River, the hardship is not just about having less water right now. The deeper concern is that the hotter months are approaching, while water reserves have already dropped sharply. If this situation continues, their lives and livelihoods will face even greater strain. What is worrying is that this crisis will not simply end once spring passes. Even if a few late storms arrive, the shortfall at the headwaters is still far too large to be reversed quickly. The Colorado Climate Center has also said that the state would need an unusually wet period throughout April to make a meaningful difference. That means reservoir levels could keep falling, water supplies could remain under tighter pressure, and the communities that rely on the Colorado River may still have to enter the hotter months with very little safety margin left. But water shortage is not the only risk. When snow melts too early and the ground dries out faster, wildfire danger also rises. In other words, the water that should have helped this region get through the hot season is no longer there, while other threats are starting to grow at the same time. This is the kind of pressure that does not explode in a single day, but it lingers and slowly wears down people's lives, from production and daily routines to their sense of safety in the months ahead. There is another major risk still lying ahead. If the 7 states fail to reach an agreement before October 1st, the federal government could impose mandatory water cuts for the first time in the history of the Colorado River. At least one state is expected to challenge that in court. If that happens, the story will no longer be only about water shortages or falling power output. It will extend into legal disputes, delayed decisions, and a longer period of instability for the communities living downstream. Seen more broadly, this is also a very clear warning for many other places around the world. As the climate becomes hotter and drier, weaknesses that have existed for years will show themselves more quickly. Climate change does not create every problem, but it makes old problems hit harder, move faster, and become more difficult to manage. A place that is slow to adapt today can become tomorrow's crisis point. And in the end, the question still remains. If people had known for years that the actual water supply was no longer enough to match what had once been allocated, why was this allowed to continue until it reached this point? And if the response does not change, how many other communities will end up paying the price in exactly the same way? If you live in a state that depends on water from the Colorado River, and you are already seeing changes around you, share what the situation looks like in your area in the comments. And if you want to keep following this crisis, subscribe to the channel for the latest updates.